Thank you for tuning into this week's episode of Money Talk. This episode just came together this week with some very relevant information coming into today's episode. So after both Rebecca and I got COVID, I'm going to talk about our experience with it. We got COVID this last week. I'm going to talk about how it also impacted our lives with work and personal finances. This episode is going to be one that covers the importance of an emergency fund and how it can make your life many times easier when it comes to worrying about work and money. With a specific experience to share, you're going to learn a good reason why having an emergency fund is crucial. We're also going to talk about how you can get started with your emergency fund and how to go into the new year and how it should be a goal if you don't currently have an emergency fund. Let's get into today's episode. You know, we don't talk about money enough. It is a topic that just gets ignored for some reason, even though it plays a role in everyone's day-to-day life. Well, this is the issue that brought Money Talk to reality. I know you're probably too busy and don't have the time to research and learn about all the things that go into personal finance, but that is where this podcast, Money Talk, comes into play. I'm your host, Skyler Fleming, and I'm here to do the research and learn all the extra stuff about personal finance for you. The goal is to simply get us talking about money. So let's get talking. Okay, let's get into today's episode. As I mentioned, my wife and I, Rebecca, and me, Skyler, well, we just got over having COVID, and it wasn't really that bad. There wasn't any huge major concerns for us, but let's talk about how it impacted the rest of our life. So specifically, let's start with work. So our first main concern was, how long are we going to be out of work? What's the rules? Do each of our employers have different rules? Are we just following the CDC guidelines? Have those been updated recently? Well, they were updated about halfway through us realizing we had COVID, and they changed once I had started to show symptoms and tested positive for COVID. They actually changed that day. And so there was some factors to consider. How long were we going to be out of work, which then leads to how is our paychecks going to be impacted? Well, lucky for us, because we have an emergency fund, we didn't really have to consider how our paychecks would be impacted, because there was a lot of reports of the symptoms of this new variant being very minor, and that we weren't really worried about being out of work for a whole long time, especially with the CDC's guidelines really loosening up to allow us to go back to work pretty quickly. We weren't that worried about how long we were going to be out of work. So our paychecks weren't really impacted because we budget based off last month's paychecks. So we hadn't even really considered the money that having COVID would be impacting because we budget based off last month's income. And doing that makes it so much easier to plan. It makes it so we don't have to worry about our current month's paychecks at all. Like, we haven't even been considering the paychecks that'll be coming in January, which is the ones that'll be impacted by us not having worked the end of December. So realistically, we had well over a month out before we would start to see any sort of impact. This is because of our budgeting plan, but also because of an emergency fund. We have at least 3 months worth of emergencies, 3 months worth of expenses saved up in an emergency fund. So we have plenty of time if we were to be out long term. And that's the piece that an emergency fund can afford you. But let's also talk about PTO, because I'm sure that's something that a few of you probably thought about when I thought of the idea of how long are we going to be out of work? Well, because we have an emergency fund in the background and we budget based off last month's income, Rebecca was able to not use any PTO, and I was able to work from home. So that made it a lot easier on me. But Rebecca didn't have to worry about using any PTO because she had 3 paychecks in December. So we just decided to use that 3rd paycheck in December towards January to help cover probably a pretty small paycheck, because she didn't want to use a majority of her PTO that she has saved up, and she wants to save it for a trip or something. So she was able to take a week off, which is going to lead into our next segment, the peace of mind that an emergency fund can bring. And let's talk about the term fun employment. So how can an emergency fund bring you peace of mind? Well, the first thing is you don't have to worry about money. And money in the conversation of how long are we going to be out work, or do you have COVID? Do I have COVID? Are we sick? How long are we going to be out of work? Money wasn't really a concern. It was definitely a conversation you have to have, because it's something that we rely on, and the lack of money brings unhappiness, but the money doesn't necessarily buy happiness. But the lack of it definitely will lead to unhappiness, as I stated. But An emergency fund, it was easily accessible if we did need it. We keep the first 3 months easily accessible, and we can quickly move money around to cover expenses. Thanks to the way we manage our credit cards, it makes it very easy to just throw the expenses that might come up on a credit card. And then if we do some overspending, or if we do need to touch our emergency fund, we can easily take the time over probably about 30 days to maybe 45 days even, depending on when you make the purchase, before the credit card statement will be even due, so that we can avoid interest, because our emergency fund can sit there and it doesn't have to be instantly available, ready to be tapped all the time for overspending and for little emergencies. Well, the other thing, like I mentioned, is the term fun employment. And because Rebecca didn't have to use any PTO and she was able to get an entire week off of work during COVID, and while she had COVID, she got an entire week off of work, was able to enjoy it at home, doing her hobbies, because our emergency fund made it so she didn't have to worry about using her PTO or how soon she had to go back to work. She could get the whole week off and just enjoy it stress-free, because she didn't have to worry about the money that she was missing from her paychecks and wanting to not use her PTO. So I kind of like the term fun employment, and it's something that having a savings account, and especially an emergency fund, can afford you. Because a few weeks ago, or about a month ago, when I was in between jobs, I took quite a bit of time off work. I was just in between jobs. I was like, I'm going to quit and focus on finding a new job. And that was fun employment, because I was able to work on this podcast a bunch. Really, I was able to launch this podcast during that time. I was able to really nail down some hobbies and those kind of things that you can't really develop when you have a full work schedule. But if you have 4 or 5 days off in a row, you can really put in place the workflows. Like a podcast takes a lot of work, but I have the workflow in place and I have the system in place now because of the time I had off work during my fun employment period. So it's a really funny word, but fun employment is something you can look forward to when you have a nice emergency fund in the background. So now let's talk about the specifics of an emergency fund. Let's get into that next. Okay, let's get into the specifics. Let's start with how much. How much do you save for an emergency fund? Well, 3 months is the very minimum. You should have at least 3 months of expenses saved up in your emergency fund. This is to cover you becoming unemployed and giving you at least 3 months to find a new job. Because if you have no job, you should be able to find a job within 3 months, but it gives you a good safety net. And 6 months, if you have a good amount of money available, if that's a possibility, I would start shooting for 6 months, especially if you have kids or accident prone people or people that maybe have more medical issues or things like that, where it might be necessary to have more money set aside. 6 months is probably a maximum before you want to start figuring out other places to put money so that it's not all just sitting in a savings account. But obviously there could be specific situations where you might need to have more than 6 months saved. But you will probably know if you're in one of those. So at least 3 months. And if it's just you and your wife, 3 months is probably fine. And then beyond 3 months, you can figure out some fun things to do, like investing in index funds or savings bonds if you want to use that for your remaining 6 months, or the other 3 months on top of your 3 month minimum, which gets us into where to save it. Well, your first 3 months has to be in an easily accessible savings account, like a high yield savings account, like a bank or one of the online banks. Or you could even put it in savings bonds or very conservative investing beyond that first 3 months worth of emergency funds. So how do you build one? Well, the first thing is you need a plan. How much are you going to save? How quickly do you want to save it? Is it going to be several $100s per paycheck? Or are you confident your job is pretty stable right now, so you can take some time over the next year to save for one? Those are things that you need to consider when it comes to building your plan towards building an emergency fund. But you need a dedicated, separate account if you've never saved this much money before. And you need to automate it with paycheck direct deposit to go to a different invisible account, so to speak. By invisible, I mean something that's not on your phone, a bank account that you have to log in through your computer, that you have to take time to sit down and look at. And in order to get money out of it, it takes a little bit of time. Something that isn't instant, no debit card, something that the money just automatically goes into from your paycheck, so you don't even see it, honestly. And then forget about it. If you can't forget about it for about the first 2 weeks, that's okay. That happens because it's something new and you just want to check on it to make sure it's working. But eventually you need to pull yourself away from it and stop checking your invisible savings account so often. That's going to become your emergency fund. It'll help a lot if you just kind of forget about it. And then when you need the money, it's there. So next, let's answer some questions that I found online that are kind of common concerns and questions to think about when considering an emergency fund. So this first article that I found online is from the Motley Fool, and it's titled, "Should I Avoid Saving for Retirement Until I Have a Full Emergency Fund?" Well, it talks about one of the first things being the need for an emergency fund before retirement, because if you have retirement savings, sure, you might be able to tap them before your retirement age, but there's going to be penalties and taxes. Like, think about this scenario. If you encounter a $4,000 emergency fund and you tap the money from an IRA at age 40, you're not old enough to avoid the penalty. So you're going to give up $400 just like that when it comes to that 10% penalty that you're going to face for withdrawing from your IRA too early. So it kind of is important to make sure you have an emergency fund in place before you start saving for retirement, because you don't want to have to pull from retirement early. But once you can start getting money into retirement, especially after you have the 3 months of your emergency fund saved up, then you can really start to see those dollars grow and grow and grow and grow over time. So it is important to make sure you have an emergency fund in place so you don't have to tap your retirement savings early and see all sorts of penalties and potentially taxes. So make sure you have your emergency fund in place. This next article is called 8 Budgeting Questions to Keep Your Spending in Check. The reason I chose this article is because it can really help you identify a few places that you can use to start saving for an emergency fund. If you think, how am I supposed to save enough money to get 3 months worth of my expenses into a savings account? Well, the first thing is how did my actual spending compare with my projected spending? Do you have projected spending? If not, that's probably the first problem. Honestly, you need to make sure you have a plan for how much money you're going to spend each month. If you're married, collaborate with your spouse to figure out how much money you want to spend that month on different categories and such. Or if you're by yourself, that's fine too. Just figure out how much money you want to spend. And then when the month's over, look back and be like, how much did I spend here? Did I underspend in this category, overspend in this one? How did it go? Did I end up saving money overall, or am I more in debt now? And then the next thing is how do you want to allocate any surplus money? So if you're living below your means, you're going to have extra money left over. What do you want to do with that? So you need a plan for really any money that you have left over. That way you can figure out where you want it to go. Right now, pretty much any money, if we come across money, is going towards a college fund towards Rebecca's PA school. So you just need to figure out your plan. If you don't have an emergency fund, any surplus money you have should be going towards that. The next one is, what was the reason for overspending? There's nothing wrong with overspending. Just don't do it a lot and you're going to be just fine. If you do it 1 month, just take it as a learning lesson and figure out what happened and try to correct it. And do you need to adjust your spending limits for the month ahead? So say you're saving for your emergency fund, doing so diligently, and Christmas is coming up. Well, it might be reasonable to cut back on your emergency fund savings a little bit if you want to. If an emergency fund is extremely important to you, it might be worth it to tell your family, say, hey, we're going to have to go a little light on gifts this year because we're trying to save some money for ourselves for a rainy day fund. And then the next one is, how are you tracking towards your goals? There are a host of finance tracking apps and websites online. Find one and plug in your information, or keep track of it on pencil and paper or an Excel sheet. Just do something to keep track of how you're going towards your goals, because all these things are important towards other financial goals beyond emergency funds. But specifically, if you don't have an emergency fund, all the things I just mentioned can apply towards saving for your emergency fund. So now, what do you do if you have to actually use that emergency fund? What if a dreaded emergency actually comes up? So what do you do if you have an actual emergency? Well, one of the key things while you're figuring out how to save for an emergency fund is to make a plan for the emergency. Write it down so that you can easily make decisions when the stress is on. Rebecca and I have this in place, and this is honestly what helped a lot to decide whether she was going to use PTO or not, how long she was going to be able to take off work and such, because we have a plan in place saying, hey, we'll tap the emergency fund if this happens, or if this happens, or if this happens, but we will not tap the emergency fund for XX. Like, I think you get the point. You just need to figure out when you're going to use it and when you won't use it. But one of the key things to do in an emergency is just to take a deep breath and be calm and understand that it's going to be just fine. You very likely have way more time than you think. So don't make any impulsive decisions. But that's what the plan is for, is that if you need to make a quick decision, then you can make a quick decision because you have a plan in place saying, what happens if we get a flat tire on the side of the road and it damages part of the vehicle. Well, we have an emergency fund saved up enough that we can repair the tire, but we can't repair the vehicle right now because that's not super necessary and it isn't a safety issue because of the damage it caused. So we'll just repair the tires and we'll move on. And then maybe we can save up down the road to repair the vehicle for the little bit of damage that the popped tire had caused. See, those sort of things can make the decision a lot easier because when you go into the mechanics, they're going to say, hey, we can also fix that damage that was caused by the tire really quickly for only $350. Most of that's labor. But then you can be like, no, that's okay. We just need to get the tire right now. But if you don't have that plan in place already, you go in there and you're like, sure, because you have enough limit on your credit cards to cover it. And you can probably afford it. You might have enough savings set aside. But if it's not in your plan, it's easier to make those quick decisions. And then if you don't have an emergency fund and you find yourself in an emergency, well, you need to start looking for how you can save one now because it makes life a whole lot easier when an emergency does come up. But if you don't have one and you have credit cards, try to use the lowest interest credit card first and pay them off as quickly as possible. And if you're careful, you can take advantage of balance transfer promotions, and they might have very little to no interest with their promotions. And especially make sure there's no fees. That's how they get you. That's how they make money on balance transfers is fees. So make sure if you're balance transferring credit card debt around, there's no interest, maybe very little interest, especially if there's a promotion, make sure there's no interest and absolutely no fees. Do not pay a bank or a credit union or a credit card company money to take your money onto their credit card to pay them more money in fees and interest. Or just avoid fees and interest altogether on credit cards. But if you absolutely have to, make sure you're using the one with the lowest interest rate. And let's wrap up today's episode with my thoughts and conclusions about emergency funds. Okay, so my final thoughts. Well, our emergency fund made COVID no worries for us. Sure, we weren't out of work as long as some people were earlier in the pandemic. So I understand there were specific situations that would have made this a lot harder. But even if we had to be out for work for 2 to 3 weeks because we were sick with COVID and facing quite a bit of symptoms, it would have been easier for us because we have an emergency fund. We easily could have taken a paycheck or two worth of money out of our emergency fund if we needed to, if that's what we had missed in work. And I'm trying to provide you hope instead of bragging. So I hope it doesn't come off as that because I'm proud of the point me and my wife have gotten to with our personal finances. And my hope with this podcast is try to educate through some of the situations we've been through and through some of the ways that our personal finance journey has helped us be less stressed about money and be a little better off with money. So I hope you're able to find hope through this podcast. And if you need any help with any part or figuring out how to save or how to budget or how to get out of debt, like I've mentioned before, I do offer financial coaching. If you search Fleming Financial Coaching online on Google or on Instagram or Facebook, you'll find my page and my website and such. So you can always reach out to me at moneytalk.ffc@gmail.com if you have questions, and I'd be happy to answer them on the podcast. But I'm really hopeful that I'm providing you information and educating you a little bit more on some of the things about personal finances. So thank you so much for tuning into this week's episode of Money Talk. The financial win of the week is going to have to be not worrying about working while having COVID. My wife and I are in a very blessed situation, and the point of this podcast, like I mentioned, is for me to be able to help out other people get to this same point. I hope you found some helpful information and some inspiring information in today's episode so that you can begin to save for your own emergency fund or understand some of the comforts that having one can provide you. And I really appreciate all of you listening to Money Talk. We're climbing right towards 200 listens, and that's really cool for me. We're quite a few episodes in, and I really enjoy creating these podcasts, and they give me somewhere to talk about personal finance. So if you have any questions or suggestions, please email me at moneytalk.ffc@gmail.com. And if you could leave a 5-star review on whatever podcast player you listen to, it would be greatly appreciated because those help a ton when it comes to getting podcasts to show up for other people when they search. So thank you for listening to this week's episode of Money Talk. I'm your host, Skyler Fleming, and I hope you have a great week.
Thank you for listening to Money Talk. The Money Talk show is provided for informational purposes and should not be used for personal or specific financial advice. Every situation is unique and different. Please make sure to do your own research for your personal financial situation.